attending now for the last 5 years. So in respect, I'm going to go to his Megillah reading, which is a small group. We're going to be doing it about 9 o'clock in the evening, and in the morning I'll go to shul as per the norm. So yeah. So
and then Friday's a short day.
Yeah. I've actually taken Friday off this year fully. I don't normally take Purim off, but because I've got a lot of holidays to use, and logistically it just works out easier for shul and everything else. So I'm taking the Friday off.
Fabulous.
So, yeah.
You have a proper Purim.
Yeah, just hang a second. Sorry about that, Rabbi. Just some of the
No worries. Being a multitasking dad.
Oh, I am. I'm going to be switching on my laptop in a minute because as I'm listening to you, I'm doing some work. It just means that I can tune in and do other things at the same time.
Absolutely.
It's the way forward. Yeah. I mean, I like to be kept busy.
I'm just wondering what's going to happen when this whole COVID thing goes off. Will you still be continuing to do Zooms and stuff for work, or you'll?
Oh yeah, our business, the company I work for, has before we had lockdown, well before it, years ago. Going back about 4 or 5 years, the CEO who set the business up through an idea that I gave him years ago was all remote learning anyhow. We don't have actually any training rooms as such. It's just done remotely. So we were ahead of the curveball for some time.
It's not your fault by any chance, is it?
Well, actually, what's ironic about it? From what I'm very friendly with one of the ladies it's a long story how the company operates. It's a bit of a family-run business where friends of friends are in the business, and I'm an outsider technically. Anyhow, there's one person who I know I can trust, and she said to me, since COVID, the business has increased because companies are not sending their students to colleges anymore, and the prices are right, and it suits me perfectly. I've got to go once a week once we're out of COVID, which is okay. I've got to do some videoing. I'm not exactly ecstatic about it, but look, it pays me well. I'll just go in once a week and leave it like that. And that's it. Right. Okay.
Let's get rolling right into the share. There's plenty to discuss. Right. There's so much to discuss. Anyone who wants to mute or unmute, please do so. If it gets too noisy, we'll have to do the mute. But for right now, it seems like it's quiet. Let's try and make it work. Otherwise, we'll just mute everybody. You can unmute at any time. Questions are always welcome. This week, last week, any Torah portion. We'll try and keep it streamlined if we can. But every piece of Torah is special. So we've got a loaded week. Loaded week in the sense that today on the Chabad calendar is a big day. It's the day that the previous Rebbe made it out of Europe. And as he set foot in the United States, he had two major statements. Number one is America is no different. Yiddishkeit worked back at the Haim. Yiddishkeit can and will work in the United States of America. And that was a bold statement to make under the circumstances, but he lived up to that tremendously. And history talks for itself. And then, of course, you had the other big thing, which was a tremendous campaign amongst and alongside, shoulder to shoulder with many other Jewish activists, trying. Oh, good morning, Elia. Welcome aboard. Trying to save as many Yiddish people as possible from the war. So that's today. Today's the 9th of Adar. It's a big day. But the famous quote in Yiddish is, America is nicht anders. For those of us who don't speak Yiddish yet, America is not different. It's not different in the sense that Yiddishkeit can and should thrive even in a modern, progressive, high-speed country, which America was and still is. But let's not talk so much about 9th of Adar because the highlight of this week for sure on all counts is Purim. Purim coming up Thursday night, Friday is a special day. Of course, we have Wednesday night, Thursday. Mainly Thursday is Tanis Esther, the fast of Esther, which we commemorate the dedication of Esther Hamalka, the self-sacrifice through which the miracle played itself out. Even though she didn't fast on this day, she fasted when she went into the king much later. Or was it earlier, I guess you could say, but it was in the times of Pesach, because that's when she met the king and saved the people. But we commemorate her commitment on the fast of Esther. And we also remember the war that the Yiddish people fought on that day in order to secure and defend themselves, secure their freedom. Then, of course, Purim is the 4 major mitzvahs of Purim, which are not getting drunk is not one of them, but getting drunk is often done and sometimes even out of context. Adel Yoda is a sense of becoming connected with the Purim message so strongly that regular calculations fall aside. But getting drunk for the sake of not caring what's coming and going is clearly not halachic. It's certainly not Jewish. Certainly a person is responsible to put themselves into only safe positions. Oh, yeah. But it's very important to recognize that there is tremendous message in the concept of getting drunk, which we'll leave for another time, but it's deep, not shallow. Although often it's assumed to be shallow. The 4 mitzvahs of Purim, very importantly, are the 4 mitzvahs of Purim are, number 1, hear the Megillah. And you got to hear it twice, once at night, once in the daytime. Obviously, this year, that'll be one of the hardest mitzvahs to fulfill. And one has to remember that if it's a situation where a person's health is on the line, it's very important not to assume that the right thing to do is to go to a crowd and hear Megillah. It's very important to get in touch with the Shaila and find out. That's what Rabbanim are here to do, and answer whether or not we should or shouldn't be going. And often the time, the answer will be not to go and hear the Megillah. But in ideal situations, yes, we should hear the Megillah once a night and again in the day, and ideally in a crowd, and we should hear the entire Megillah, every single word. So much that if we missed one word, we have to hear it again. So it's quite intense to hear the whole Megillah and hear it in the original form and hear it in live voice, not over Zoom. Although there's been indications, people have assumed that what the chief rabbi meant to say is that it's okay. It clearly isn't. It's not Yotze the Megillah. You could not make a bracha on hearing the Megillah over Zoom or over any other electronics or non-human voice. But we do have the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah when we can from the scroll, read by a human being, and hearing it live, not missing a single word. That's number 1. Number 2, of course, the big mitzvah is to give Mishloach Manos food gifts. And this is not charity. A food gift is a gift to friends in order to increase friendship mainly. And that is given to somebody who you know, who knows you, and it knows that the gift has come from you and it's for them, and it increases the feeling of friendship. And that's important on Purim. Now, of course, the mitzvah is to give food gifts and give gifts that are readily edible. They don't have to be cooked. They should be ready-made foods. And it should be delivered on Purim in order to increase the joy of Purim. Ideally, it should also be sent on Purim if possible. If not, it should be sent by an emissary who will do an agent on your behalf. But that should include 2 food items. And of course, bringing friendship to fellow people is important across the board. But on Purim, the specific mitzvah is by way of food. Say it with food. Say it with food is the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos. And ideally, men should give to men and women should give to women. Everybody is obligated to do it. Men, women, children, everybody should be giving their own gift. And if you have family, friends, maybe bear in mind that one gift is on your behalf, mitzvah, and the other gift is perhaps somebody else, the wife or the child, somebody else is giving a mitzvah. But everybody should give an opportunity to give. What's often overlooked is that the mitzvah isn't to receive, the mitzvah is to give. So by receiving Mishloach Manos, it's a good start because you've enabled someone else to do a mitzvah. But don't stop there. Keep on sharing the mitzvah, keep sharing the love. Of course, the 3rd mitzvah is giving charity specifically to poor people. So poor organizations, even if they're doing great work, is a great mitzvah. It should be done on Purim, but not instead of. The mitzvah is to help poor people be able to celebrate the Purim. And that, again, should ideally be given on Purim day. And if there's no way you can get it out on Purim day, then you can give it a little delayed, but it should at least be allocated. That means set aside physically. It should be physically placed in a different location as in designated towards the mitzvah. Of course, today, certainly this year, there are a lot of organizations. Let me just put a plug in here for the food bank. The Chaim Food Bank is giving out delivering money on the very day of Purim. It's a click of a button. But that way you'll be able to fulfill the mitzvah in a very good way. And then the 4th mitzvah is the easiest mitzvah, but unfortunately, oftentimes overlooked. It's so easy. And the mitzvah is to have a meal in honor of Purim. We all have breakfast or lunch We're going to have, even if it's Friday, we're going to sit down sometime to have a meal. But if you make it special, at the very minimum, have in mind the Yom Tov of Purim, have your extra Harmon tash or some part of your Purim gift, but do it with the mindset of Purim in it, and the mitzvah is done. It gets tricky because having a sit-down meal late in the afternoon on a Friday comes into all sorts of halachic questions because you're running into Shabbos. Will you have to stop for Kiddush? Are you allowed to wash so late on in the day? When are you going to ruin your appetite for your Shabbos meal? But if you're having breakfast, you're way ahead of the game, and it's a mitzvah done. So don't forget to have a meal, and that's where saying l'chaim is appropriate. But again, this year, even the more so, one has to be careful that getting drunk does not interfere with any mitzvahs, including the mitzvahs between man and his fellow, and certainly also between the mitzvahs of keeping Shabbos, making Kiddush, davening, and everything else that a person should do. So taking it in the right stride is important. Okay, we shouldn't forget anyone who else who can't do the mitzvahs, but that's a little bit about Purim, what's coming up. Let's do a bit about the Parshah, what's coming up, because Parshah Tetzaveh is a loaded Parshah. We started last week, we didn't do a shir, but we missed also a fantastic Parshah in which we had the dedication where Yiddish people were given the opportunity to build a home for Hashem. In simple terms, in English, if somebody loves you and says to you, I love you so much, if you invite me to your house, I'll be there. I'm coming to meet you. I want to spend time with you. That's the story of Hashem talking to the Yiddish people. Unfortunately, it was right after we were given, we had transgressed the golden calf, so we weren't in our best terms. But Hashem says, don't worry. Certainly, the end of the building, even according to Ramban, was at a time where the Yiddish people had every reason to think that they blew it. The relationship was over. And then we try to make amends, and Hashem says, you know what, I'll give you a certain set of luchos. When we worked really hard, we davened, and we asked Hashem for forgiveness, and Hashem said, fine, I forgive you. Here's your second set of tablets. We got it. Then Hashem says, no, that's not enough. I want
Good morning. Can I interrupt?
Yes, please do.
Okay. First of all, apologies for being late, but I need some help. And that is, I want to give something away for Purim. Do you know any family that would benefit? I've got a very good quality 2-seater green leather settee to give away.
You know what, Malcolm, that's a great idea. Let's be in touch right after the share. We'll do a picture, if you don't mind, on the WhatsApp or something, and then we'll find a good home for it through the L'chaim Food Bank. Yes, they do take that. I can't promise I'll be out by Purim, but we can definitely send the message out.
Okay, thanks.
I love it.
Rabbi,
Yes, Asher.
just wondering, you've not mentioned Machatzit shekel, did you?
Correct. We did not mention Machzas HaShekel. Machzas HaShekel is a minhag. It dates back from the time of the halacha. It's not directly associated with Purim. It is generally given on Taanis Esther. And if you haven't done it then, you do it on Purim, which this year will be Friday. But giving Machzas HaShekel is not specifically to the poor. Giving a half a shekel commemorates the donation that was given to the times of the temple, the Beis HaMikdash, which we were going to tie into last week's parsha. We're just doing a quick summary. Last week, we were talking about donating towards building a home for Hashem. And then after the Mishkan was built, there was a daily a sacrifice, an offering that was brought on behalf of the whole people. How do you have an offering that is representative of the entire people? Because everybody is equal in the fund that funded those offerings. The gifts we gave to Hashem in the morning, the evening of every day, was funded by the half shekel amounts that everybody gave equally. So the wealthiest of wealthy and the poorest of poor, every person would give, every man of age would give half a shekel, and that would be the fund. It was also a census that they would be able to count up how many half shekels there were. But the Machzas shekel was given every year. When was it given? In the month of Adar, they would announce it, and had to be given in time for the month of Nisan. That would be the new year. So in the month of Adar, there would be one of the wake-up calls, one of the reminders. The WhatsApp groups were all binging away, and really the announcements were made by the Sanhedrin to remind everyone to give the half shekel. And traditionally, we give the equivalent of half a shekel. Now, we don't have half shekels, and we don't even know how much exactly half shekel is. It's made of silver, whatever it was. Today, we give half of whatever currency you were in. So if you happen to live in the United Kingdom, it'd be half a pound, 50 pence. And once you give 3 50 pences, chazaka, to give it extra strength. So we give
How come
350p.
in Israel it's worked out that it's about 35, 30, nearly 40 shekels? That's quite more than 50p.
Much more, but not only that. In other countries, they give different amounts. Usually, when it comes to shekels, we don't necessarily, if we're just commemorating the idea, we don't have to give the actual worth. Although it's much better to give more charity, but it's symbolic rather than a mitzvah. And therefore, we give half of whatever currency you are. If you happen to live in America, you give 50 cents. If you lived in Australia, you give whatever, or in Europe, you give 50, half a euro, whatever it is. The idea is symbolic. Now, of course, in Eretz Yisrael, half a shekel is not very much, but they give more. Half a ruble when you buy you a matchstick. Okay, I like it. Yeah, you keep me busy here. 1 second. And then we have, the idea is to give the half a shekel to who? Who do you give the half a shekel to? Who should we give that charity to? So, of course, you could give it to the poor, but ideally to a place of Medrash, Talmud Torah, or a shul. Because the idea is it's symbolically commemorating the Mishkan, the home of Hashem. And we're saying that the home of Hashem is what Hashem says to us, I'd like to be with you. Can I meet up? Can we meet up? And then that's the story of a shul. Hashem says, make me a home, and I would like to come and meet you there. And of course, the Medrash, we can't go without saying, it tells us that the home doesn't only have to be the bricks and mortar. The home is the heart of every Jew, and the heart that is open to welcome Hashem is a heart where Hashem feels welcome. And that's where Hashem comes to. So that's tremendous. Okay, that's last week's Parsha with Machzis HaShekel. Let's talk about this week's Parsha. The Parsha continues that the uniform of the staff that worked the Holy Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, was very exact. So exact that it had to be made with particular types of material, had to have a particular color, particular shape, and it had to be only those items. But here's where it gets even more exciting. They were not allowed to have what's called in halacha chatzitza. Chatzitza means anything that divides between the clothing you're wearing and the item. If you think about when a person goes to mikveh, they have to make sure they're not wearing a band-aid, a plaster. They have to make sure there's no dirt on them. They have to be cleaner than ever before you go into the mikveh, because there cannot be a chatzitza. There can't be anything that divides, that blocks between the water of the mikveh and the person. The same was true with the kohanim. They had to shower. They had to be clean before they got dressed. I mean, it's great practice, but it's also important. Imagine they were doing offerings and there was blood all over the place. If they got dirty and there was blood between themselves and the clothing that they're wearing, they had to stop doing what they were doing and wash off. Otherwise, it's like they're not wearing the uniform properly and won't be kosher. So it was one of those interesting things. Of course, the uniform couldn't get dirty, and if it did, they had to change. But that's the idea. There was a rule and regulations of how their staff would wear. So much so that if they weren't wearing it, it was a very serious avera, and the Kohanim would have to be very careful with it. So there was clothing for the Kohanim, and the Kohen Gadol had, the high priest had an additional 4 clothing, including the breastplate that had all the stones, and the Me'il, the blue cloak that had the bells on the bottom, and as it would walk in and walk out, people could hear the noise. And the sounds of the holiness should be heard when he enters into the holy, which is a quote which was used later on in Lamed Dalet, would be 1974, when the mitzvah tanks first started hitting the streets of New York and they were making noise. So the Rebbe quoted this quote: sometimes making Jewish noise is important. And the Rebbe connected to the fact that there's so much noise in the world, so much distraction. There has to be a sound of holiness that you can know that actually it's not only bad things that are making noise. You could be a Jew in the 21st century and be proud to be Jewish. You can have what to say, you can have an opinion, but you can be able to share it in an acceptable way and people will appreciate it. It's 2021. This is the time where people are willing and open to hear good things. People are happy to accept. The story continues in the Parsha that we have how the Kohanim were inaugurated. Yana says Jewish noise, but not in the library. Unless it's a Jewish library, of course. There we go. But then you have the end of the Parsha, which is the last of the items that were designed inside the Holy, and it's the golden altar. Golden altar was not used to bring animal offering. It was indoors, and it was used for incense. For the Keteres, it was considered one of the holiest avodah services of Hashem, and it was very specific recipe. That was the golden altar that's also designed this week's Parsha. So as we said, there's a loaded Parsha. We have now a few minutes we want to pick one area to focus on, and it's not going to be the Parshah. It is going to be Purim. We're going to focus on a Purim message. Of course, this week the highlight is Purim, and not only that, this Shabbos, although it'll be after Purim for us here in the UK and around the world, in Israel, in Yerushalayim, in certain places, it will still be Purim. It'll be the beginning of Purim. What they call in Purim this year is a Purim Meshulash, a triple Purim, because their Purim, which is always one day after our Purim, due to the story of the people in Shushan, the walled city of Shushan, having to have an extra day of defense and only able to celebrate the next day. So their Purim was one day off. But when it falls out on Shabbos, because we have Friday, the next day is Shabbos, some of the things you can't do on Shabbos. So what do? They read the Megillah on a different day, and they have 3 days of Purim. Oh, nothing like it. Nothing like having 3 days of Purim. Sorry, one more time, Asher?
I'm just saying, it's wonderful.
Oh, yes. No, yeah, and we don't miss out. We don't leave it behind. When it comes to the end of our Purim and it starts Shabbos, we do something extra on Shabbos to make it a Purim-filled Shabbos. And then when they're partying on Sunday to have the completion of their Purim, we don't miss that either. Let's make next Sunday special also, even though it's not really technically Purim for us outside of Yerushalayim. But we do something extra. You maybe have an additional L'chaim or additional Harmon that's left over or something to make it extraordinary. And that's a good idea. It's a good mitzvah. As the last one, the one time we can't travel to Israel, all the fun is there. Let's make the fun here. Interesting, the last halacha that we have in the whole, the Shulchan Aruch of Orach Chaim, the final closing halacha is that when it comes to, it's talking about Purim cotton, but when it comes to opportunities to make and to borrow the fun, the excitement, the holiness, the specialty of a Yom Tov, even if it's not mandated, even if it's not mandatory, it's still a good idea to do something extra. And the quote that the Ramah Islish, the Ashkenazic version of the Shulchan Aruch tells us, "V'toiv leiv mishte tamid." The good-hearted find an excuse to always make it special, to always make a feast. And that's us. We're people who have so much to be grateful for. So much good is going on. Of course, the headlines don't tell us that. The headlines tell us all the exceptions to the goodness that's going on. And therefore, they're full of not good news. But we know, Aruch Hashem, there's so much to be grateful for. And therefore, we don't need to we don't have to look hard to find opportunities. Every time they present itself, we should exercise the ability to celebrate as we go along. So let's talk a little bit about Purim.
Melech, yeah? Shlomo HaMelech said that.
Correct. Tov Lev Mishte Tamid is definitely from Shlomo HaMelech. Correct. But it's a message for all of us. Let's take a Purim message.
Also that you mentioned, also
Please.
You mentioned about the clothing of the Kohanim.
Yes.
And what we've learned last week that Achashverosh, because he was in Persia, they've taken some of the thing from the Bet HaMikdash, some of the treasures. And one of the things that Achashverosh, one of his punishment really, is that he actually put on one of the clothing of the Kohanim.
Correct.
Was the big sin.
Yeah. And the Achashverosh lived in Persia. Persia was the continuation. They had conquered the Babylonians. And therefore, they had access to the treasure homes of the Babylonians, which included the spoils of the war against Judea, against Israel, against Yerushalayim. So yeah, that's how he had access to it. But let's talk about a lesson, a practical, relevant message from Purim story to 2021, to this 21st century. What has to do with us? And of course, you can imagine that every part of Torah has enormous amount of message. The word Torah means, it comes from the word Hora'ah, teachings, directions, and Torah is full of living lessons that are ever applicable. But in the Purim story, what's tremendous about the Purim story is so many divrei Torah were shared about over Purim, because every year Purim becomes a celebration and it becomes a focus, and scholars and tzaddikim and leaders around the world throughout the ages have been teaching Purim messages over and over again, almost as much as Pesach, you could argue. But what's even more important is that the Purim story takes place when the Jewish people don't have their own autonomy. The Purim story didn't take place in Jerusalem. It didn't take place in Israel. And it didn't even take place in a time where we were leaving exile, like the Exodus story, the Pesach story. We were leaving and heading. It was a time of freedom, which is a great message, but it isn't directly the same as we are today. The Purim story has much more similarity. The Jewish people living in a foreign country are trying to make it work within the nation or amongst the nation, within the kingdom in which they live. That's very similar to what we are today. We're living here in the UK. There are other fellow Jews who live in different places. And throughout our history, in the past 1,000, 2,000 years, that's what we've been trying to do. Trying to work with and within the kingdoms and the nations that we live amongst. We have tefillos that we say, the shloimeh shel malchus, to the peace of the governments. We daven for them. And we try and make it work that we should be able to live amongst them. Now, unfortunately, the Purim story is not unique in the sense that sometimes living amongst other nations brings its own troubles, especially when we find ourselves on the wrong side of the law, not because we did anything wrong, but because of who we are. And that was the Purim story. Yiddish people were caught in a bind, not because they did something wrong against the law, but because the very fact that we were Jewish. And that, unfortunately, is the story of so many parts of our history. And what we're going to learn today is that there's a Yiddish approach to this tzara, and the Purim story, in a sense, has never been more relevant than ever today. So although we aren't, Baruch Hashem, we're not in a situation where we have the similar Harmon 80 years ago, that was very much the case. And years before that was also the case. Baruch Hashem, that part of the story is not the message, but the other part of the story is Mordechai and Esther, their leadership and what they taught us has never been more relevant as it is today. That's the argument we want to make. That's the suggestion we want to make, that they're teaching us a lesson that was pending, was waiting to be actionable. And only now, in the 21st century, or the end of the 20th century, has it finally become relevant more than ever. And what's the message we're referring to? The message we're referring to is the Mordechai's stance. Because if you think about it, we're going to do a few texts here. Mordechai was a little bit of an instigator, an antagonizer. He created a big part of the mess. Let's just do a couple of reads here. Here's a quote from the Megillah Starim. The verse implies that Mordechai only called for Purim to be commemorated with joy, but he did not call for its documentation nor its annual public reading. It was Esther who primarily pushed for this. As the Talmud relates, Esther sent to the sages, write my story for future generations. Mordechai, even after the whole Purim story, said we should make Purim into a special day, but he wasn't intending to create a Megillas Esther. Just a fun fact, it's great to know. The last story that was recorded as part of the Tanakh is the story of Esther. The story of Hanukkah, which took place not that much longer, maybe 200 years later, the Hanukkah story did not make it into the Tanakh. There was a Megillah written, but it never became part of the sacred written books. Maybe the word is canonized, but it was never made into one of the Tanakh books. And although there's a mitzvah to light your Hanukkah candles, and it's considered legislation, it's not optional, it's not a suggestion, it's a mitzvah. It's one of the 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, as is Purim. Purim is unique in that Purim became part of Tanakh. It's a written book. And we read the book of Esther as part of the mitzvah. And that was Esther's breakthrough. Mordechai wasn't intending on doing that, but Esther asked the Sanhedrin to do it, and it was accepted. And we're going to discuss today a little bit about why Mordechai, although he was the great leader, didn't think of it. But Esther, from her viewpoint, did come up with it. Not only she came up with it, when she presented the idea, the Sanhedrin took her up and accepted her idea and made it part of Jewish tradition. There's a new book in the Tanakh called Megillas Esther. It's one of the 5 Megillas. It's one of the Ksuvim. It's one of the 24 books of Tanakh. And we're going to discuss that. But first, let's have a look at why Mordechai, in his position, was different than Esther. The students of Rishon Mechai, this is great. A quote from the Gemara in Megillah. I mean, the Gemara in Megillah is really interesting. There's some really, really cool parts about Megillah. I mean, all the Gemara is important, but some of the interesting stories. What were the Jewish people saying about Mordechai? Not today, when he's our hero, he's the hero of the story. What were the Jewish people saying back in the day? You know what? What were the Jewish people saying whilst he was leading before the success of the end of the story? Now, you have to remember, we know the end of the Purim story. It ended well. The Jewish people who lived through it didn't know the end of the story. They were living through the story. It was scary. Oh boy, was it scary. There was the final solution in the most extreme way. We know the story, yeah? Harmon had the plan, and one day he was going to kill all men, women, and children. And Mordechai is leading the people. What's he tell them to do? Fast, pray, and study Torah. Do teshuvah. That's the Jewish reaction to the story. What do you think the average Jew on the street had to say about Mordechai back in the day, before we read it in South? You know what? Let's take this text off the screen. I'm asking anyone know what the Talmud's going to tell us people were saying about Mordechai.
He's crazy. Let's get the weapons and defend ourselves.
Absolutely. What is the Meshuggah thinking? That was one option, but the Gemara says it was more than that. He was more.
They probably didn't like him.
They didn't like him? Well, some did, some didn't. Okay, sounds Jewish. Why would they not like him?
Well, because they probably didn't understand him.
Didn't understand him. We're going to say some more words.
Well, he was making himself out. Well, people want to hide in the background, don't they? They don't want anything too high profile, and people assimilate in the environment, and they don't want anybody to differentiate them and highlight their
difference,
individuality, or that they're different.
Amazing, very much so. I'm just going to open this chat here. I do apologize. The chat takes a. Okay, 1 second. We have an idea like this. The Purim story is recorded in the Megillah, and you can look at some of the word in the Megillah. It was clearly not just written to be a book of heroes, because you have in the Megillah story also parts which are not complementary to the Jewish people, but it's all in there because it's got all the story as it took place. Here's one of the interesting quotes about Mordechai, and the Gemara is going to book on these words and tell us how the Yiddish people felt. Remember the story of how the decree, Harmon's plot, came to be in the beginning? Harmon decided to kill the Jews based off a very particular incident that provoked him. It's in the Megillah. All the king's servants who were in the king's gate would kneel and prostrate themselves before Harmon, for so the king commanded. But Mordechai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself. Okay, so the Gemara is going to talk about why not. But this is the fact. Everybody bowed before Harmon, and Mordechai didn't. And then when Harmon saw that Mordechai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself before him, Harmon became full of wrath. But it seemed contemptible to him to lay hands on Mordechai alone, for they had told him Mordechai's nationality, and Harmon sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout Achashverosh's entire kingdom, Mordechai's people. Mordechai insists on not bowing, but he happens to work at the royal gates, which means Haman's going to bump into him regularly. And every time he walks past Mordechai, he gets wound up to the point where he says, I'm not just going to get back at Mordechai, I'm going to get back at all the Jews, because Mordechai is a Jew. And if he's not bowing down, it's the Jew inside of him that's not bowing down, and therefore he turns his guns at all the Jews. And the Jewish people were aware of this. And that's why the Gemara Megillah says the following. Scripture says there was a certain Jew, a Yehudi, in the capital city of Shushan, whose name was Mordechai, the son of Yar, the son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So he was from the tribe of Benjamin, but is called Yehudi. Yehudi means he comes from the tribe of Yehuda. So which one is it, Yehuda or Benjamin? So Rav expounded. The congregation of Israel said, look what a Yehudian has done to me, and our Benjaminite has repaid me. What does it mean, a Yehuda? A Yehudian has done to me refers to David's culpability for not killing Mordechai's grandfather Shimi. Shimi ben Gera was punishable by death because he had cursed and he'd been disrespectful to King David, and David had spared his life. And it happens to be that Shimon Megera ends up being the great-great-grandfather of Mordechai. So the people would say, oh, what a shame that David didn't finish off his grandfather so that Mordechai wouldn't have been born, which allowed for Mordechai's birth and his eventual incitement of Haman's jealous vendetta against the Jewish people. Equally, he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and how Benjamin has repaid me refers to Shaul's culpability for not immediately killing Haman's grandfather, Amalekite King Agag. So they're wishing Shaul had killed Agag so Haman wouldn't have been born. And in the same sentence, they say, oh, he's also from Yehuda. And why did Shimon Megera survive so that Mordechai's here? In other words, they saw Mordechai part of the problem, almost the same as Haman.
Levi,
Please.
I think there is maybe an obvious counter argument.
I'm listening.
There are the words in Megillat Esther, somewhere towards the last part, where Mordechai is talking to Esther, and he tells her, if you are not going to save the Jewish people, I don't know how to say it in English, but help will come from elsewhere. So I think you can apply the same logic over here. If it hadn't come through through Mordechai, the argument would have come up anyway through somebody else. But you cannot deny the fact that Mordechai was putting oil in fire. As you say, he acted arrogantly.
Yeah, firmly.
Firmly, okay.
Okay, good point. So we know that those who want to hate us are going to find the reasons to hate us, but something about Mordechai's behavior made it come faster, gave them the excuse they were looking for. Fair enough. But the argument to that is, we could have maybe avoided all excuses and delayed it for a very, very long time. But Mordechai wasn't embarrassed at what he had done. And although there was the murmuring on the streets of what's this Mordechai doing to us? Why is he behaving in such an antagonizing way? What is he doing? Mordechai's leadership was followed. In other words, although people weren't happy with his path and they had arguments, they all bought in to his way. So much so that by the time the end of the Purim story comes about, just before they know the end, just before they have the miracle, the Jewish people, here's the question, why was Mordechai going out of his way to antagonize Haman? It seems like his act of defiance is problematic. But what's amazing is that the net result was the miracle came about because everybody bought into his plan. So much so that the Talmud tells us, where's this quote? Here, the quote of the Jewish people from Gemara and Shabbos, the Jewish people at the Purim story time re-accepted the entire Torah at a level that was greater than the Mount Sinai revelation. What they accepted at Sinai was one level. Yeah, please go ahead, go Neville. Go ahead.
Obviously, there was a great victory and God helped them win. But how many Jews died in the process of defending themselves? Yeah. And if Mordechai would have taken a different tact and decide, you know what, my friends are telling me to bow down, the religious community are telling me to bow down, forget it, it's not worth it to antagonize him. It's only going to have an impact. So I'm sure somebody advised him it's going to have an impact on what would have happened to Harmon if he just played the game like you do in other countries. You play the game because there's a big, because we don't want to stir the pot. What if he would have just played the game? What would have happened to Harmon? Would he have automatically got to be the king's advisor? And would there have been an implication against the Jews afterwards?
Great question. What would have happened at Mordechai played? And so the starting point is to remember that Haman is already the king's advisor. And not only that, it's also important to remember that the king was so easily swayed at Haman's plan So much so that the Gemara, the Megillah records that when Harmon came and tried to buy the Jews with money, the king says to him, you can have them for free. You can do whatever you want with them. I don't need a penny. So something already shows us that was very weak links. It goes further than that. And the idea is that had we just played the game, then we would have had a good chance, just like we have in every other situation throughout history. But equally, we have to remember that the Jewish people were never as well positioned politically. We had everything that they needed to be able to be assured and secure in their political stance. What was the story? You had Mordechai was well connected in the palace. He had royalties for having saved an assassination plot against the king. You had the queen happened to be on their team. You had the Jewish leadership, the Beth Din, the Sanhedrin, was looked up upon, and throughout the whole Babylonian exile, the Jewish minds, scholars, were considered the greatest thinkers of the time, which is why when Nebuchadnezzar brought the Jews down in chains, he didn't make them into slaves. He forced them to be his advisors because they recognized the wisdom amongst the Jewish people, but it didn't stop the anti-Semitism. And so therefore, Mordechai's argument was, let's put it on the screen. We had it before, but let's not put it on the screen. The idea is that Mordechai says to the people, we are a sheep, a lamb amongst 70 wolves. And therefore, we shouldn't try to seek to antagonize them. But what we do have to remember is that the reason for our safety is not because the people are being nice to us. We have to try and make sure people are nice to us, but never at the cost of looking after our shepherd being faithful to the shepherd who keeps us safe. So here's the fine line. It's easy to say that all we have to do is try and find favor in the eyes of those around us, because it's true according to halacha. But we have to be careful not to forget that the only reason we're finding favor amongst the people we live amongst is not because it makes sense logically, because logically it doesn't make sense. And the proof is the Harmon story. Because Mordechai behaved a certain way, that became an excuse to kill all his people. Not only that, the king would authorize. The Jewish people were a major part of society. They were a major part of the finances. What made the king give a green light to Haman's plan? And the answer is anti-Semitism. And you could say that it was Mordechai's instigation, but it's not logical that it should be an acceptable answer that because Mordechai stands his way, therefore all the people should be killed. And that's not something that we could expect from a reasonable people. And if we leave it to logic, it's quite clear that we wouldn't have had a safety net. We would have hoped for it. We could have tried and delay it, but it was brewing. It was brewing so much that the minute there was one excuse, it blew out of proportion. And Mordechai understood that. He was a worldly man. He had a job at the royal palace, not because he was a loser or because he was a schlepper or he knew how to say Tehillim. The reason why he was working the palace gates is because royalty, the kingdom understood his importance. They understood his brains. He knew what was going on in the real world. And that's how he knew what was brewing underneath the surface. And that's why he said the only answer to this is not to try and find more favor amongst the wolves that are looking for an excuse to attack us. Right now, what we need is prouder Jews. And this was Mordechai's leadership. And so much so, even those who were upset with him that we read in the previous text went along with him, because they at this point realized, not only because we're in a mess and there's no other way out, but they recognized that finding favor in the eyes of those who could be turned around in such a small instant to such an extreme way, there has to be a better and more important way. Go on, Neville.
What evidence have we got that King Ahasuerus was a weak king? Obviously, you said he was obviously easily influenced by Harmon, one of his main advisors. But obviously, he was a king of 127 provinces or whatever, and was obviously confident enough to have a party because he reckoned, is it 70 years afterwards, he was free of the prophesizing of the Jews coming back. But it's easy to say that he's a weak king, but I've never heard that. He was influenced by his main minister, but did that mean he was necessarily anti-Semitic?
In terms of, if we were to measure by the terms of modern society, goes without question that he was. To accept a suggestion to annihilate an entire nation because the minister is upset with them.
Maybe he thought it was the Kurds or somebody else. I don't know. They're just one of many.
That would be equally.
He might think lots of the minorities, and I don't know what minorities would be. What percentage of the Jews were there, for example, amongst the population?
Good point. So exactly, let's say it was the Kurds, and he would say, you know what, you want to take away the Kurds? No problem, go bump them off. Is that acceptable behavior? Not only is it acceptable behavior, it happens to be that the Jewish people were quite influential. As recorded in the story when he tries to kill Vashti 9 years earlier, and he asks the Sanhedrin first. So obviously the Jewish leadership were quite influential. But in the context of that period of history, from when the Jewish people were conquered in Jerusalem, they were considered honorable people, as in they were considered mindful people, but they were conquered, and they were therefore secondary. And here they were making it very big. They were very influential, so much so that when Darius was going to allow the Jewish people in the next generation to build the Beis Hamikdash, most of the Jews stayed down in Persia because they were that well established amongst the nations. They were that well, you might even use the word assimilated or blending in. They had all their businesses, they were doing very well, they were very influential at the time, and therefore they weren't rushing to leave. But if the king could twist in a moment, and many things he was very strong, but if he was willing to let the Jewish people, to sell the people for nothing, it kind of indicates of how much trust we could have had in them in blending in. Says Mordechai, well, our real mistake is not that we haven't been favorable enough to the people. What we have to realize is our mistake is that if we are a lamb amongst 70 wolves, we need to make sure that the shepherd who's protecting us is happy with us. Not just make sure that the wolves are not hungry or the wolves are not upset at us. Much more important is to make sure that the shepherd is not upset at us, because the shepherd has been protecting us. And obviously the shepherd is Hashem. And this flies in the face of modern way of thinking. But not only that, it flew in the face of most of the people who lived in Persia at the time, who were also modern in their time. And that's why we have that quote from the Gemara. Because to the average Jew at the time, this didn't feel right. What are you on about finding Hashem? We've got to be safe, and then we'll deal with Hashem. We've got to make sure we're protected. And once we're protected, then we can go and serve Hashem. Of course, we'll go to shul and we'll learn. But first, let's make sure we're safe. And Mordechai comes around and says, no, it's the other way around. If you want to be safe, make sure that Hashem is happy with us. And then, of course, look after the details. Now, Mordechai had a master plan in which Esther played an important role. But now what I want to do is I want to focus on two viewpoints. And we're not going to use the viewpoint of the people and Mordechai, because that's too close for comfort. Let's use the viewpoint of Mordechai and Esther. Esther had 2 feet on the ground. She lived in the royal palace. Day in, day out, she involved herself in what you would call regular, normal, real life, in the realest sense of the word. One bad move in the palace could cost you your life, as what happened to Vashti, predecessor. And she knew how to play the game very, very well. She walked on eggshells, you could call it. She knew exactly what she could and couldn't do. But she was also very righteous. If you read the Megillah, it's very clear. The Megillah holds her in very high esteem, and she was considered someone who went on Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice. Certainly, if you read the Talmud and the Midrash, she's considered a tzaddikus. She's a prophetess. She's considered one of the holy women amongst Jewish people.
Kiddush Hashem.
There you go. Now, Esther had a different viewpoint. And what we're going to do is we're going to notice, even after the miracle plays itself out, looking back at what took place, Mordechai had his viewpoint, Esther had her viewpoint, and that's why Esther championed that we should have Megillah written, and Mordechai didn't. And this is interesting because what's an interesting matter, it's not just, oh, you've got the rabbi versus the layman, or you got the Yiddishkeit fanatic versus the person down to earth. Two heroes in the Megillah story, and each one represents a different school of thought. I think this is great. This is interesting because Esther seems to have a special understanding that the Megillah story doesn't just have a spiritual win. The Megillah story also has a physical win. And Mordechai, for whatever reason, focuses only on the spiritual win. Let's put it into simple English. Mordechai says that the Purim miracle is the miracle of a nation tracing and finding back its roots. So the miracle is that the Yiddish people did not rely solely on their connections, on the diplomacy. The miracle is that the Jewish people, even those who were the murmurers and the shushkarers, who were upset with Mordechai, also went along with a plan and decided to return home. And that's a miracle. In spiritual terms, it's the greatest miracle. It's the miracle of Yiddish people, their neshama. You say in Yiddish, the pintel yid, the Jewish spark coming out to the fore and shining forward. And that's the Purim story. How should we celebrate that, says Mordechai? We should make another Yom Kippur. You have Yom Kippur once a year in Tishrei time, and that commemorates the second set of tablets, the second luchas that we see from Hashem. Let's make a second one, another Teshuvah date, a Purim that will be a time where we'll recommit ourselves on an even greater level. Spiritual Purim. And that was Mordechai's idea of how to make a commemorative date. That was Purim in Mordechai's mind. Comes along Esther, says, no. We're going to make it a day of partying, of celebration where we'll enjoy our Yiddishkeit, and we'll enjoy our Yiddishkeit in a down-to-earth way. It'll be a celebration of the here and now, not just a spiritual win, but a material, worldly win. And in order to do that, we're going to record the entire story. That's going to include all the diplomatic toing and froing. It's going to include what got us into the mess in the first place. And it's going to include the route and the path, the plot of how we managed to turn it around, which will include the fast and the prayer, but also how we had to use our diplomatic ties. And there is Mordechai versus Esther. Esther, from her perspective, she also, I must say, let me just put it in there for Esther because we sounded like we're downplaying Esther. Esther's approach was also very, very spiritual. She did not make a move until she had a guarantee from Mordechai that all the Jewish people are going to fast and pray on her behalf. That's spiritual. That's not just diplomatic, but it goes more than that. She risked her life to go into the king to start the whole thing rolling. She did not walk into the king before she herself fasted for 3 days. And the obvious question is if she's trying to wow and entice the king with her beauty, with her attraction, and try and buy her way in, why is she fasting? Certainly she should be exempt from fasting. She needs to be on her best. She needs to look good. She needs to be able to talk smoothly when she walks into the king. Yet the Megillah describes how she walked in after 3 days of fasting. Go explain it. And what's the answer? What was Esther thinking? Help me out. Anyone? What was Esther thinking?
Just to win his heart so that she can eventually tell him.
So why was she fasting?
She wasn't allowed to say that she was Jewish, so she had to keep that a secret from him. But also to see if she could win his heart so that she can then ask.
Correct. So she needed to be able to win his heart.
Can I say, please?
Yeah, I just want to rephrase the question in 1 second. The question is, Esther's walking into King Ahasuerus at the risk of her own life, and she's trying to entice him to win his heart. But she fasts for 3 days. Obviously, she doesn't look her best after fasting for 3 days. She's not thinking as she would. She would be slowed down. Her physical health would have been compromised. Yet this was the preparation she had in order to make the key part of the story take place. So that the question is, why did she do it that way around? Yona, go ahead.
I think she was gathering I think it's both gathering spiritual strength, looking for spiritual support, and maybe also getting courage, because she knew it was going at the risk of her life, as you say. So she needed to come with a very good plan and have clear mind.
Okay, go ahead. Anyone else want to add to that?
I think maybe that she wanted Hashem. She wanted his support.
She wanted spiritual support
in what she was doing. And I think that's why she fasted, so that Hashem would be with her to help her through.
At great cost. I mean, I have two suggestions from Elia. She wanted to look slimmer and she wanted to be too tired to talk, which is a bonus. I like both suggestions for Purim. It happens to be back in the day, I think looking slim wasn't considered good looking. Back in those days, you had to look the bigger the better. The idea is that she certainly records in the Megillah that the reason why she fasted was for the same reason that the people fasted, to do teshuvah. And this is our Esther. We've been trying to present her as if she was the down-to-earth, practical, diplomatic personality. And she also appreciated that even spirituality needs to be translated into practical diplomacy. Diplomacy not just meaning in the hierarchies, but also down to earth. You want to be able to live amongst people, you've got to work with what you have. You have to be able to make it work with the people who are around you. And this was Esther's approach. And that's why we have the Megillah till today. And she insisted on making the Megillah a part of Yiddishkeit. And it became, the Sanhedrin accepted it. But she also made sure that it wasn't just a spiritual celebration, it's a practical, physical celebration. So now we have two teachers in the Megillah story. We have Mordechai on one side, which says, get ready, we are Jewish and proud, and we are backing down for nothing. And we have Esther, who's like almost walking a fine line. Of course, we'll do what we have to do to find Hashem's favor, but also we'll try and package it in a palatable way for the people around us. Esther and Mordechai. And they both teach us a very important lesson. The great phrase there is, trusting the status in society for protection is what got the Jews into trouble. Mordechai's brazenness and Esther's fasting and prayer showed the way back by example. But Mordechai's lesson has always been on the back burner, because Esther's lesson has been true for us throughout the ages. Throughout the ages, we do always, just to mention former Chief Rabbi, the late Rabbi Sachs, who would often say that non-Jews are proud of Jews who are proud of the Yiddishkeit, and non-Jews are embarrassed of Jews who are embarrassed of the Yiddishkeit. And this is true for the anti-Semite equally. Very important for us to remember this, that even if we have people who don't like us, it doesn't help to be embarrassed of our Yiddishkeit. It doesn't mean you have to be in everyone's face. That's not always correct. But never to be apologetic. Never to be apologetic. It's dangerous to not be proud of who we are. So important. And now there's a new era. And here I want to share with you a text that I have against the clock, which the Rebbe makes a massive deal out of, saying that it's never been as good as it is today. And now, let's say it outside, where we have today in today's society, that the world is looking at every person and expecting them to have an opinion. That's what drives social media. Everyone has something to say about something else. Today, people are looking forward to hearing things that are out of the box. People respect people who have an extremely important position. The previous Rebbe lived in a different time. He lived in a time where the communists were hunting down people who were practicing Yiddishkeit, but he had the same approach. He walked into the communist regime and he walked in like a Mordechai. He says, you know what? I don't care what you do to me. I'm a proud Jew and nothing else. It happened to be he also had 2 feet on the ground, and he managed to run a very successful underground, which meant that he understood how the system worked. But in the face of it, he was as proud as can be. But today, it doesn't work like that. We don't have to have self-sacrifice to be proud. All we have to do, here, this is the one I'm looking for. Today's generation has been witness to a sea change in the treatment of Jews. the obstruction to Jews' free expression are gone. As our host nations now give us free reign to do as we please, and the Rebbe would often call America, which in where he lived, a Medina Shel Chesed, a country of kindness, and we have to recognize and appreciate and be grateful to them for that. England's no less. Consequently, the onus is now on us. It is up to the Jews to take hold of it, be fruitful and multiply greatly wherever they are, as is already taking place in many places. The United States, among other countries, have adopted as a tolerant stance. Even countries that recently restricted Jews, he's referring to Russia. Not only are Jews free to follow their own destiny, moreover, world governments are now assisting us to do so. Where does that leave us?
Levi, what about France?
Yes, even France, where there are restrictions, have tremendous freedom to be able to do their Yiddishkeit. And of course,
in Paris, you sure?
Yes, I'm sure. I have a lot of friends in Paris. There are hardships, let me tell you.
Well, I thought there was the scenario that you're not allowed to wear yarmulke in public.
Yeah, yarmulkes, and then you have bris and you have shchita. There are troubles. Indeed. But the idea is that there are ways around it. You can wear a peak-cap, you can wear a hat. It's absolutely fine. But the idea is that it's not redemption. It certainly is not the final stage. But we've come a long way, such a long way, that even the French government, certainly the Russian government, there are so many places that respectfully honor the needs of religions, and which is amazing. It's a golden era in our history. And what's important for us to do is to recognize that the only thing stopping us now to be like Mordechai Tzaddik is our own self. A person has cognitive distraction or distortion, where we convince ourselves that we cannot be proud Jews in current day because it's going to upset so and so. The only person who doesn't realize what's going on is ourselves. And here's the call of Mordechai. Purim message for 2021. People around us are happy for us to be proud. Proud Yidden. You can share your Yiddishkeit. You can share what you know with friends at work, and you know that they will be listening with respect. You know that they will be listening and try and help you if they can do what you want to do. And that's never been the case as much as it is today. And what the call of Mordechai is, that if this is the case, then not only should we be indoors trying to make sure that the shepherd who has protected us for 3,000 years is happy with us, we should make sure that those around us are aware of where we turn to for our assistance. This is very important. The people who respect themselves will find others respecting them. Not only has this been a suggestion, this has been practiced and tried and tested. What we need to do is to do the same thing with ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to antagonize, and Mordechai didn't do that either. But Mordechai never apologized for what he was doing. And that's one thing we should take on board. Purim message, no more apologizing for being a Yid. Certainly not apologizing to our Jewish friends for being Jewish. Being willing to show up to the world fully Jewish. Fully Jewish means there's nothing embarrassing about being a Yid. If somebody has a problem with it, we can work it out. But I'm not going to apologize for being a Yid. I'm not going to apologize for being who I am. And if Purim gives us courage, this is the courage we're looking for. Shem should bench us, that we should have that courage. We should feel excited about that courage. And it should bring us to, like the Purim story, Mismach Geula La Geula, bring on a real redemption. I think this is a powerful idea, and it's doable. It's something we can relate to. Once again, I just want to share, if you have the 4 mitzvahs that we have to do, if you have anybody who needs help with the Megillah, I think in Beis Menachem they're doing an outdoor option this year, to make it COVID safe. You can pre-booking as necessary. Mishloach Manos, the mitzvahs to give. If you don't want to leave your house, JS is doing a full delivery service where you click on the button and you buy your friend a takeout meal. It's the best way, because that way they'll also do the meal, but also having a meal on Yom Purim, and of course giving charity to the poor, the chaimfoodbank.co.uk. You'll get yourself sorted. I wish everyone a wonderful Purim. Thank you for joining. Thank you for learning. If anyone has any questions, please unmute and ask. Oh, I see some messages here. 1 second. Legal norm in Britain, British Jews, America. Yes, and I've seen Jews who wish they were Jewish. Yeah, there's anti-Semitism in America also, just across the whole middle. But that's not the point. The point isn't if we do or don't have anti-Semitism. The point is that we have to be proud of Jews. That's our job. Our job is to be more proud of who we are. Have a wonderful Purim, everybody. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, please, I'm here to
Thanks, Levi.
answer.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
Bye.
Birchas
Levi.
Kohanim.
All the best.
Yivarech Adonai v'shmerecha, Yer Adonai upon Melech v'chonech, Yisad Adonai upon Melech Yisad Adonai upon Melech v'semcha shalom, v'som Shmiya b'nei Yisrael v'ani avarchem. Happy Purim, everybody.
Man, כנראה רצון
Yeah.
שכוייח.
All the
Happy
best.
Purim. I've sent you the picture. It's on your phone.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We'll get it sent around and we'll be in touch.
Thank you,
Right,
Rabbi.
thank you.
Levi.
Call
Thank you.
Tov, all the best.
Rabbi,
Levi.
Take care.
question.
Please, questions. We love questions.
Okay, what you thinking? What's gonna happen for Sudat Purim Friday? Yeah, like you were saying. So how can we get it so that we're able to eat later and stuff like that? So what time you thinking of doing Suda? What is the right thing?
The best thing to do is in the morning. The latest time to wash without problem is 5 to 3. So if you sat down to wash before then you still have the problem. You want to be able to get into Shabbos with an appetite. If it's after 3 o'clock, you want to sit down to wash, it gets a little bit more tricky. One should still have a meal. There is a concept of Pores Mapa Mukadesh, where you make a meal that starts in Purim and continues straight on into Shabbos, but you have to stop your meal in the middle and make Kiddush and daven and then continue again afterwards. You get into a few halachic debates of what's the best way to do it, which is why it's best avoided if possible. But there are ways to do it. In Israel, I think it's quite common where you make a Purim Suda start on the end of Friday, and then you go straight into Shabbos, make Kiddush, and you have Marev, everyone's around. With Corona, it gets a little bit more tricky, because if you're going to go to shul, you can't really have the party there, and you have to come back. It gets a little bit more thing. Having a meal on Purim, though, is simply done by having a meal. If you have Zoom, it's a great time to do a Zoom party, because Zoom is allowed on Purim. Not for Megillah so much, but more for the party. It's a great idea.
Right. Okay.
Fantastic. We're on a mission. Yaina, how are you? Good to see your face.
Good. Yes. I have a few remarks.
Take care.
Go ahead, Yaina.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Asher. Bye, Malcolm.
First of all, I was listening about Esther,
enjoyed it.
and I think I have another idea. She was fasting to also be connected.
I'm not sure if it's my internet. Your internet? Go ahead.
I think it was her idea to fast. She told Mordechai, tell everybody to fast and pray for 3 days, and I will do the same. And I think she wanted to have a feeling of unity with everybody else, also, apart from other things.
Interesting. Very interesting idea. Yes. But that would, again, be the same theme where she was trying to gather spiritual credit for the diplomacy to work. Does that make sense?
And also, yes. Also, I have a question about last week's Parsha. There is a point where God is telling Moshe, this is how, I don't know the exact English term, but he says, this is how you make this, let's say, a cradle, and you need to make a cover for it made of full gold. And on both ends of this lid, you need to make the angels, cherubim. And he mentions it specially, don't make them separately and solder them on or something, but you need to make them out of one piece of gold. And I think it's not only one place, on many other instances where he's talking, you need to make something, make sure you don't make different parts and glue them together, so to say. You make them out of one single piece of metal. I think it is important, but I couldn't understand why. So I don't understand why it has to be from a single piece.
The other good example is the menorah. It was very intricate, very detailed, and with 6 branches, 3 on each side, plus the middle, it would have made sense to make it in pieces. And the idea is, of course, the temple wasn't just a beautiful place. It was the place where heaven meets earth. It was the place where Hashem's presence brought down energy for the entire world. So what was designed was made to mirror exactly the type of energy that was necessary. So we could assume that making it one piece was a big part of that in order for the energy to flow appropriately. But what a message it means to us, so maybe this is not the reason, but one of the messages it means to us is that although we have two sides to our life, a right side and a left side, we have, let's say, our spiritual side and our physical, mundane side. You have your work life and you have your davening life. That has to be made out of one piece. It's not just one person being dragged one way and dragged another way. When I'm at work, I'm not embarrassed of my spiritual life. And when I'm at spiritual life, I'm not embarrassed of my work life. It's streamlined, it's one me. And this is not only an important thing in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism, it actually is healthy. Because otherwise a person's living a dual life, you're being dragged in two ways. It's not a healthy way to live. You're never at home, you're never at peace. I'm always making sure this, when we're streamlined, when everything about me and you is all about finding Hashem in this world, bringing Hashem down. So davening is not a contradiction to going to work. And going to work is not a contradiction to davening. I don't wish that my work colleagues don't see me while I've got my tefillin on. And when I've got my tefillin on, I don't wish that my rabbi doesn't bump into me when I'm at work. Why? Because I'm proud to be a servant of Hashem everywhere. And it's carved out of one piece. It's not soldered together. Stick this on, stick that on. And it's a very Hasidic approach or Hasidic message, at least from you see it clearly how Hashem's Mishkan is designed. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Fantastic. We're on a mission.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful week and hopefully we'll see you Tuesday.
Yes. And one more anecdote I forgot to tell you.
Please.
Talking about the government support.
Yes.
Latvian government changed the COVID rules on Purim days, especially for the synagogues to be able to celebrate Purim.
Oh my wow. Do it carefully. This is the news. Breaking news. Fantastic. That's very exciting. Latvian government.
Yes.
Is he a Jewish president you have? No.
His surname is Levit. His father is Jewish, but he, on public, he's behaving, I would say, anti-Jewish, but still the government, this is what the government does.
Wow. What do we know? What do we know? What a wonderful world we live in. Lots to be grateful for. But don't forget the shepherd. Don't forget the connection to Hashem.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.